Welcome back to our special series titled The Great Resignation, brought to you by Stearns Financial Group. Within this episode, we will talk about how the pandemic and its indirect effects impacted women in and out of the workforce. This is a major conversation, whether we're discussing stay-at-home moms who have had to take on further responsibilities like remote learning, or working mothers who have had to either take a step back in their careers or be put on double duty to continue to balance their work but take on further everyday duties for and with their children. While every family must make this complex decision on their own, weighing consequences like cost of childcare, general happiness, and career satisfaction can make this a difficult conversation. The pandemic has added additional concerns and has forced some families to make more challenging elections that may not be what they had originally intended. Our discussion focuses on these women or caregivers who have been forced to re-examine their preferences based on additional conflicting factors like medical concerns, increased economic challenges, or various other competing issues unique to this unprecedented period. Today, our team discusses specifically how women have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and the economic consequences of women stepping away from the workforce. Although we acknowledge that there is much more on this subject that we just do not have the time to cover. As usual, if you like what you hear, please be sure to follow and share to keep the discussion going. Now here are your hosts, Dixson and Lindsay Brock.
Welcome to episode 3 of the Great Resignation by Stearns Financial. My name is Dixson, and today I'm joined by Lindsay Brock, Holly Madasser, and JT Thomas. And today is a very special episode because it is National Women's Month, and today we're talking about the impact of the pandemic on women and their work. And so I grew up with a single mother, and I was just reflecting on the fact that I was basically a latchkey kid growing up. So, mom worked 60 to 80 hours a week, and me and my sister would come home and wait for mom to get home to make us dinner, put us to bed, et cetera. And then this particular situation, I think a lot of mothers have faced issues as schools have closed down. They may not have had that option that my mom had to, put us on the school bus in the morning and have a babysitter pick us up coming off on the other side. So the question is as I thought about it, I was like, how would my mother have handled this? Because she didn't have the option to drop out of the workforce. And we have seen that women probably dropped out of the workforce a little more over the past couple of years due to the pandemic than men have. And you add on to the exacerbating factor, it happens to be that my mother's a nurse. And so not only would she have the logistical issues of figuring out how to handle 2 kids without childcare provided by the school system, basically, but then that additional fear, the psychological fear that she would, as a nurse in a community care facility, that she could potentially contract COVID and bring it home to her young children. So I don't know how she would have dealt with the situation and the additional stress just to being a single mother of the pandemic. But I know that, all being said, I have full faith that my mother would have figured it out and we would have got through fine. But Holly, you also raised children and had children that went to school. Obviously, now they've graduated. What are some of the unique challenges that you think that mothers especially and women more generally have faced during the pandemic?
Well, thanks, Dax, for the question. Let me start by saying that if your mom were raising you today, she would have the benefit of technology on her side because she could potentially do something like telehealth, which wasn't an option at that time. And for me, when I was having kids, and I don't want to date myself, but we didn't have Zoom. It was a lot harder for me to manage a career with 2 young kids, especially when my husband was working himself 80 hours a week. So I think that that's one of the issues that I'm hopeful is a bit of a silver lining in this pandemic, is that because of technology and the option to work a hybrid schedule or remotely, that women are able to continue to participate in the workforce. That's huge for me looking back in hindsight. As your audience probably knows, I've written a couple of books surrounding women and trends. And one of the trends I see among boomers is a lot of gray divorce. And one of the primary reasons I hear from men divorcing their wives is that they don't do anything. they raised kids. Now what? They're not engaging. They don't have skills. They're just more boring somehow. And it's really sad that that's the case, but that's actually what I hear. So I think it's very, very important for women to participate in the workforce and to continue to develop themselves as human beings, not just as mothers.
So talking specifically about work now, so there are people who do have the benefit of either having hybrid schedules or using Zoom or other technologies to do their jobs. What about those women who may be in career fields that do not have those benefits? What challenges have they faced? And I know that we've seen a reduction in women participating in the labor force. What's driving that?
Yeah, so I think still we're down 1.5 million women from the labor force, which is a huge negative impact to GDP. I mean, this is a problem that as a society we have to solve. So what's driving that, obviously, are the people that can't work remotely. They don't have that luxury for a long time, and this is abated somewhat, but we don't know with this next version of Omicron. Schools weren't even an option. I know that when I did re-enter the workforce, for me, school was the savior. It was the babysitter. So I knew from at least 8 to 2:30 or 3 o'clock, I could focus on my job. But if you don't have that luxury in today's environment because of a pandemic, how can you work? And we've seen tons of examples of women who just are unable to manage their kids' schoolwork, dinner, all of that, and also just leave them for a job. Daycares are often closed, so it's just not that easy.
Sure. Well, Lindsay, I know that the other day we were talking, I think you're planning a 1-year-old's birthday party right now, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes.
And so you became a mother for the first time during the pandemic, and I'm sure talking with some of your friends and around the community that may be in a similar situation with either young or school-age children, what are some of the challenges that you have faced personally, or maybe they have faced during the pandemic that are specifically maybe that women have to do more of the caretaking, et cetera, that may fall on the shoulders of women more so than men during the pandemic?
Yeah. Thanks, Dax. And so you're right. So I had a baby in March of 2021. And so she is 1 year old now. And so I was so fortunate to work from home most, if not all of the time that I was pregnant, and also that she was growing out of the infant stage into toddlerhood. But it was still difficult. We had to make the decision of childcare because I did want to return to work, and I love my job. I love what I do. And so we had to make that decision between an out of the home childcare, daycare situation that could be closed or sporadically afford her the risk of contracting COVID when she's not vaccinated, or we could bring somebody in. And fortunately, we did have that option. But a lot of families don't have that option because of one reason or another. It could be cost. But also, my friends, I do not envy those who have had school age kids who have had to deal with those closings with daycare or school. And you could once a week be sent, have your kid be sent home because there's an exposure at school, or you have to help with remote learning. Gosh, remember that challenge, and learning how to do Common Core math while you're still supposed to be working your job. So I don't envy those who have had to make that decision. I feel quite fortunate because I've had the ability that I've had to pivot and work from home a majority of the time. And that's even with, again, a great spouse who, although an inflexible job, does try to take as much of the load off as he can. But it's still never going to be, I shouldn't say never, we still strive all the time to make it as close to 50-50 as we can. But there are a lot of things that moms do that dads are not quite there yet.
Sure. Well,
Moms
I know.
are uniquely suited and broadly skilled, right?
Yes.
Oh.
So I know
that sounds like an excuse, not a reason. Just saying.
So I know that one thing that's been more normalized is take your child to work day. I think I went to the hospital and the nursing home only once a year with my mom, or out of necessity. If I had, the lack of childcare, she had to scramble. She'd put us in a corner conference room with a few coloring books kind of situation. But I think we've all seen the picture of the weather woman with her baby as she's pointing out the nor'easter coming through the Midwest or whatever. We've seen those pictures. I've been fortunate to see your daughter in a few meetings, Lindsay, as well as other young children throughout the organization. I think you touched on an important point, though, when you talked about you wanted to come back to work, and obviously you're a valuable resource here with us. And there's many valuable women who have a skill set that do want to transition back to work. And I think that if we step back and think about the broader economic impacts of women leaving the workforce and staying out of the workforce, it's not just that, our organization has to go out and hire somebody. It's this compounding impact of skill development for that woman and for our economy throughout, decades being within the workforce, which, Holly, you mentioned earlier, as you transition into the later years, the great divorcing phenomenon, and the empowerment that women may lose by not having that compounding career and being economically empowered. So JT, I just want to ask you, when you think about kind of the macroeconomic impacts of maybe a reduced participation rate of women in the workforce because of this imbalance of caretaking responsibilities, what are those long-term impacts, and maybe what are some solutions that we as a society can introduce to alleviate some of those?
You're asking, obviously, the really big question, and certainly the overarching theme of this whole series is about the Great Resignation. So putting it in context, we're getting some very positive developments. Over the last 6 months, the labor participation rate has rebounded. So we're seeing people return to work in earnest. That makes sense. We're seeing a lot of those issues around caregiving and the immediacy of the health crisis are abating. So that's very helpful. I think that labor participation rate on whole is still about 1% below where it was going into the COVID crisis. And that points to what Holly was just mentioning, that there are 1.5 million, particularly women who were previously employed who now are not. So that has a lot of economic consequences. Obviously, you can think about how big a gap that leaves in a lot of household budgets, and even more so if they are the sole provider. But I think, Dax, you actually shared a really interesting statistic in some of our pre-discussion, just pointing out the differences across societies. And you think about some of the European models that are able to figure out a different balance in this mix of women's participation. So, I talk to my folks in our team often about what's your highest and best use? What are you most motivated at? What are your skill sets best aligned to? So if you think about that from a societal level, there are a lot of extremely skilled women. I think put this in context also that, women are graduating from college at a higher rate than men are. And that's been pretty persistent over the last 20 years. So clearly there's a lot of skills that if your only option is be in the workforce 100% or be out of the workforce 100%, we're missing out on those contributions. I think Lindsay alluded to just the cost equation, and you can picture a lot of households sitting around the kitchen table trying to evaluate, if you go back to work, you're losing, a huge percentage, 60, 80% of that net benefit through the cost of daycare. So trying to find that remix as a society. And I'm fairly optimistic that what we've learned through COVID with remote work does afford a different power to a lot of the labor force, and an ability to remix jobs in different ways through more flexible work environments, so that both spouses or a sole provider has a lot more ways to enhance their income. You can even picture the single family household or single parent household who is able to string together more lucrative jobs than maybe what they were able to do before.
Sure. And I think, just looking about through the history of the United States, when we had the post-war explosion in the industrialized United States economy, a good portion of that could be attributable to women entering the workforce more so than they did before WW2, because the experience of, we did need women within factories helping support that effort. And then once they got there, all of a sudden you had dual income households, maybe for the first time in history, and the lifestyle that afforded, and that kind of pushed us forward to today. So if you think about like overall growth models in an economy, just philosophically, the labor force quantity is a big piece of that, but also the quality of that. And you alluded to that more women are being educated now than ever, even more so than men. So losing that economic resource from a macro perspective is very harmful. However, I think, Holly, you pointed out a few statistics that are still new, and maybe just the first green shoots of kind of the next phase of the Great Resignation, which may indicate that women are reentering the workforce, right?
Yeah, so women are reentering, but before I get into that, we talked a lot about how women can enhance GDP by participating more, but I guess I want to tag onto your comment about quality. Women bring a different perspective to the workforce. And if you look at startup companies, for example, those that have women on their boards actually are statistically more successful. It doesn't mean that women's opinions are better or worse than men's. It's more the diversity of thought that's important. And so I think I would augment the concept of not only does it help financially on a macro and micro level, but I think it actually promotes better results within the workplace, to have a different perspective that's unique to women included in the mix. To that end, yes, women are reentering the workforce. I think we've actually gone from 2.5 million down at the start of the pandemic to 1.5. So that says that about 1 million women have reentered the workforce. Interestingly, they're entering at a faster pace than their male counterparts. That's probably partially true to the fact that there were more of them that left, but they're also entering at a higher rate. So it seems that they're negotiating better outcomes for themselves financially. And I would attribute that to it's just harder to figure out the childcare and the dual role of a mom and working. And so it's going to take more to draw you back out once you've demonstrated that you can do it at home without working. And secondly, I would think that they were underpaid to start with. I mean, there was a gender gap in pay. And so maybe this is helping promote more equality in terms of now we have a shortage of workers, so they have a little bit more leverage in bargaining for themselves, let's say.
Right. Holly, I know we all know the statistic, we hear it every year about equal, the National Equal Pay Day. This year, it was on March 15th, which signifies the day in a new year in which a woman needs to work to be able to earn on average what a man did the prior year. And those factors are even worse when you look at women of color, but specifically just women. It was March 15th this year. And we hope that becomes earlier and earlier as we continue to raise the 83 cents on a dollar that women earn versus a man. But I think that we're working towards that. And you're right, women are enticed to come back into the labor force more aggressively as there is that need.
Well, I think putting that in a really longer term view, I mean, you've seen a lot of change post-COVID that, for a long period of time pre-COVID, you could see that, the average wage was pretty stagnant. So we've had this kind of step change due to that demand. But broad brush, the biggest contributor to economic growth is labor force growth. And so to the extent we're optimizing, we need to recognize that there's a lot that goes into that calculus. Obviously, there's an significant value to having parents at home caring for kids, being able to provide that level of attention that you can't outsource, right? And particularly in situations where children have different needs, whether it's learning needs, whether it's disability issues. So there are a lot of households that don't have the luxury of making a more flexible decision in that way. But we know that birth rates have been going down a long time. We've talked about the demographic changes in society. We're seeing it come true even more as we talk about the post-COVID issues around supply chains, maybe a setback or a pause in globalization, the idea of being able to onshore. Well, our greatest constraint in being able to do a lot of that is the availability of labor. So again, coming up with more flexible models to embrace this hybrid work environment and allow folks to participate more fully in the way that they want to is going to improve their economic power and going to improve overall outcomes. You know, again, having folks participate at rates like they did in Europe is about a 5%, maybe actually a 7% increase in our total GDP. Just for context, because we're living through this right now, it's about $1.6 trillion. That's the size of the entire economy of Russia. We're talking about all the sanctions and everything going on with Russia and Ukraine. But if we had women's participation in the US approach that of Europe, it would be like putting an entire Russian economy on top of the US economy. So again, we're not saying that that has to be the ultimate priority, because caregiving is of immense value, but just purely thinking about the economics in this this changing world, it points out the value there.
So just quick clarifying, when you say it would increase by 7%, it wouldn't go from like 3 to 10%. It would go from 3 to, I guess, 3.21, 3.25%, something like that, right? It's not 7 percentage points, it's just 7% growth, right?
Well, I was putting this a different way around. So, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting here, Dax, but you know, $1.6 trillion would be the impact of bringing women's participation rates in the U.S. up towards what we see in a lot of Western Europe. Okay, so that $1.6 trillion compares to a U.S. GDP that's approaching 23 trillion. So that's where I was saying about a 7% increase in your GDP.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's, I mean, it's substantial when you think about it in terms of that's the entire Russian economy. And you can just add that on top of what the U.S. is already doing. That's a substantial bump. So
and just to make it a little more fun, isn't the Russian economy about the same size as the Italian economy, which, you know, Italy seems a little more palatable right now.
Sure.
Olive oil, not petroleum.
Exactly.
Yeah, so the last thing I wanted to touch on is we are starting to see some trends reversing, and maybe some other trends that are going to be a little bit more, that are here to stay. So what do you think are the trends that obviously one of those is as women re-entering the workforce that may be reversing right now versus stepping away? And what are those trends that you think are going to, you know, be enduring and maybe change the way that women interface with work in the future?
Yeah, so I think one of the trends we've been talking about for decades is urbanization. And I think the pandemic is actually resulting in a period of deurbanization. And we've had periods of deurbanization in the past, but it's always shifted back around because the allure of the city is pretty big. I don't know if this will be the same, because in this instance, we have technology to support it. So you actually can live at the beach and still make the salary that you made living in the big city, right? And so that's a difference. I don't know if it's enough of a difference, but for the time being, I think you can look at New York and the Bay Area and see mass exodus. And one of the states that's really benefiting from that is North Carolina, in terms of massive inflows of people. And we can see that in the real estate prices. So yeah. I think they also do test with credit cards. You know, you can kind of capture how people are migrating. So there's a lot coming out of the Northeast and the West Coast toward the Sun Belt primarily. And I think that is a trend that may not change. And then the other one is globalization. You know, we've talked for a long time about globalization. You know, you can't predict a pandemic, right? But it happened, and all of a sudden, globalization with the supply chain issues wasn't as popular, you know, so we are trying, as JT alluded, to reshore jobs, and I don't know how long that trend will last. I mean, my guess is that there'll always be some things that we want to shore locally, you know, drugs, those kinds of things, but I don't think the trend of globalization is gone.
Yeah, certainly not.
One piece I want to jump on. I know we've mentioned remote work quite a few times in this conversation, and that's something that the pandemic we all know has accelerated to a great extent. We were inching our way there, right, beforehand, but now that's so much more common, and we're seeing a lot of companies come back in hybrid ways, which is wonderful. So I think that's a trend that's going to continue. Probably we'll back off and find some kind of hybrid. 50-50 or whatever type of best practice. But I do want to add a little bit of not to be a Debbie Downer, but a little bit of a warning, or just something to remember is we know that, seeing people at work and being in person is so important with camaraderie and making sure that you do have that togetherness that is present less on Zoom. But to consider the fact that if women are the ones who are taking advantage more of the remote work opportunities, then they might be the ones who are not, showing up for the water cooler talk. They're not the ones that are going to be in your face, who might be the first one you think of when you're considering who to promote or who to give a presentation to. And so those could just put a little bit of a damper on women's career growth generally, and that could slow things like healthcare benefits or 401k benefits that would have accelerated along with that. And so I think just keeping an eye on that second or third kind of consequence that could happen within a company is something that we should just keep an eye on.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more, Lindsay. It's ultimately, we have to solve the child care issue in this country. It has to be affordable to everyone. It can't be that some people can afford private care, or some people can afford, some people's mothers have to do it. Some people, we've got to figure out a way to enable women to participate to the extent that they want into the workforce and in the office if they want. Mm-hmm. They can't rely on hybrid work only as a mechanism of working. Right. I think that's what you're saying.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate all of your thoughts today on women in work during the pandemic and how that's being reshaped and redefined as we speak. I know I have full confidence that my mom, if she had to work within a pandemic, she would have figured it out. Fortunately, she didn't have to juggle that extra ball because she certainly had to juggle enough with two kids under 10 at one point, and having to work and all of those things while also going to school, mind you. So we will continue a lot of this discussion around trends in our final episode of The Great Resignation, which is going to talk about what's next now that people are getting more comfortable with quote unquote living with COVID, barring another variant that's more virulent than Omicron proved to be. I think that may be transitioning into that normal at some point, and talk about some trends that were sped up by the pandemic and pulled forward, and some trends that may be overstated but being caused by the pandemic. One of those may be deglobalization, like you were talking about, Holly, but more to come on that. Again, thank each one of you and your thoughts today, and until next time, take care.
Bye.
Thanks.
Stearns Financial Group is an investment management firm with offices in Chapel Hill and Greensboro, North Carolina. Securities are offered through Hightower Securities, LLC, member FINRA, SIPC. Hightower Advisors, LLC is an SEC-registered investment advisor. Refer to brokercheck.finra.org for more information. This podcast is copyrighted and all rights reserved. The content of this podcast is for information only and not intended to serve as financial, legal, medical, or any other form of professional advice.